If you look at any organism and ask, why does it have that specific trait? Why the long neck of a giraffe, the streamlined body of a fish, or the shape of a bird's wing? The standard answer is almost always the same. Evolution shaped it that way. In other words, that trait gave the organism's ancestors some advantage, helping them survive and reproduce. And over time, it was passed down and refined across generations through the process of evolution and natural selection. For example, for millions of years, the ancestors of a bird were shaped by their environment. The birds that survive passed down their DNA. Therefore, the specific shape, behavior, and goals of a modern bird are the result of millions of years of natural selection. Okay, so now, along with evolution, the other factor that influences the form and structure of an organism are the fundamental laws of physics. Physics establishes the basic rules of the game for what the biological matter can do, both at the microscopic as well as the macroscopic levels. On a microscopic scale, physical laws govern the foundational mechanics, such as how cells adhere to one another and how chemical reactions burn energy to power the body. On a macro scale, massive physical forces dictate the biomechanics of an animal's shape. For example, the fluid dynamics require fish to be streamlined to manage drag. Aerodynamics dictate the shape of a bird's wing for lift and for airflow. And gravity demands that heavy animals like elephants grow thick legs to keep their bones from snapping under stress of their own weight. So together, this combination of evolutionary history and physical laws forms the standard framework that biologists use to explain why living things look and behave the way that they do. But Michael Levin's lab encountered a massive puzzle that this standard framework of evolutionary history could not explain. Michael Levin's team took ordinary skin cells from a frog's embryo, separated them from the rest of the embryo, and put them in a petri dish. Now, you might expect these cells to just die or maybe spread out into a flat, boring layer of skin. But instead, these cells spontaneously clumped together to form entirely new microscopic living machines, which they called it as xenobots. These xenobots use their tiny hair-like structures to swim around, navigate mazes, and most shockingly, they also form a kind of replication, self-replication. That means they reproduce. So they ran around the dish, swept up loose cells into piles, and sculpted those piles into the next generation of xenobots. So they call this process kinematic self-replication. Later on, the lab did the exact same thing, but this time with adult human lung cells, which they named it as anthrobots, since the cells were taken from human body. Again, these creatures are tiny creatures that could travel across a dish and actively heal damaged human neurons. Now, this is where the standard biological framework completely breaks down. Because now we have this important question here. Just now, I described the behaviors of the xenobots as well as the anthrobots. So now the question is, how did they know how to behave that way? Because there has never been any evolutionary selection to make a so-called good xenobot. A good xenobot. because the xenobots, or the anthrobots for that matter, did not develop as a result of millions of years of evolution. These were artificially created by humans in a lab. So, how did they learn how to perform these behaviors like swim around, navigate the mazes, and self replicate? Because, as I have just talked about, the standard evolutionary theory dictates that complex, goal directed behaviors must be learned through millions of years of trials and error in a specific environment. Yet, these artificially separated frog cells, I mean the xenobots, are exhibiting entirely new, highly coordinated behaviors out of nowhere. Without any evolutionary history, these cells know how to use their hair like structures to successfully navigate mazes without bumping into walls. And most shockingly, as I've just mentioned, they perform self replication. That means they can reproduce. They're essentially biological robots, but they can also reproduce. So, this raises a massive, almost a paradigm shifting question. How did they learn how to do this? Because it contains a frog's DNA that is, as far as the accepted theory goes, it must learn to do frog things, not xenobot things. Because a frog's DNA spent millions of years learning how to be a frog, and it never spent a single day learning how to be a microscopic, maze solving, self replicating xenobot. So, as per the conventional explanation, if complex biological behavior is strictly the result of a long history of of environmental selection and evolution, how do we explain artificially created creatures, that is, the xenobots? How do we explain artificially created creatures that have zero evolutionary history but still possess highly specific and new behaviors right out of the box? Now you might think and ask, did they edit the genes of these cells? And the answer is no. Michael Levin's team did not edit the DNA of these cells. The xenobots have 100% normal frog genome, and similarly, the anthrobots have 100% normal human genome, but they still act as if they are a completely new organism and behave in completely new ways. So now the question is, if these behaviors were not, number one, they were not shaped naturally via evolution and natural selection, and number two, nor it was artificially programmed through gene editing, where did this behavior come from? This is where the concept of Platonic space comes in. So now we're going to cover the topic of Platonic space. So to find the real explanation, Michael Levin looked at mathematics. So he turned into something, as I've just mentioned, the Platonic space. Now, what is this Platonic space? Sometime I'll start with a very basic definition of what it is. A Platonic space is a different realm of reality, which is not part of the physical world that we live in. Now, although it has the word Plato in the Platonic space, but Plato himself did not refer it to as Platonic space. So the thing is that Plato himself was one of the earliest persons to come up with this concept of a space or of a dimension that is non-physical in nature and that is not a part of the physical world that we live in. But he himself did not call this Platonic space. So he used this concept of a higher realm of reality, which is called as the world of forms, where, according to Plato, perfect geometric shapes and mathematical truths existed. And according to Plato, the physical world is just an imperfect reflection of these deeper truths. By this physical world, we mean the world that we live in. This world is an imperfect reflection of the pure geometrical shapes and the mathematical truths that existed in the world of forms. This world of forms is also known as the Platonic space in today's terms. But Plato himself did not call it as Platonic space. Now, let me give a very simple example and very short example to maybe try to help clarify these things. So, let's consider a perfect circle. So, in the physical world around us, that means in the world around us, if you see, there are a lot of naturally occurring things that looks circular in shape, but they are not perfect circles. They might have some imperfections within it. So that's what Plato meant when he said that the world is just an imperfect reflection of these pure geometrical shapes. But the real perfect geometrical shape of a circle exists in this Platonic space. So suppose if you close your eyes and just imagine a perfect circle. So that's what exists in the Platonic space. In the real world, there is just rough approximations of a square of a circle. You'll never find a perfect circle in the real world. Of course, if you try to engineer it, then you might get very close. But again, it's a matter of perception. If you use a very advanced microscope and try to zoom in, you will definitely find some imperfections within it. But the perfect circle that exists in the Platonic space, that's the pure and the perfect form of a circle, which can never exist in the physical world, according to Plato. According to Plato, only the imperfect form of this pure shape of a circle exists in this planet. Okay, so that was a very, I would say, basic explanation of what is a Platonic space. Now let's start with an example that Michael Levin gives as to how organisms use the patterns that exist in the Platonic space. Okay, so the first example that Michael Levin gives is that of cicadas. So it's an insect. It's a kind of an insect that stays. Okay, again, to clarify, within cicadas there are different types of cicadas. What I'm going to talk about is just a specific type of cicadas that exhibit this behavior. So cicadas stays underground and only hatch every 13 or 17 years. Now, why do specific numbers? Because 13 and 17 are prime numbers, which makes it mathematically incredibly difficult for predators to sync up their own population cycles with the cicadas. So, through this example, Michael Levin is trying to highlight that the cicadas are exploiting a fact of mathematics to survive. Okay, again, to mention, not all types of cicadas does this. Most cicadas have an annual reproductive cycle, but the fact of prime numbers are being exploited by only certain types of cicadas. So that's just a clarification that I wanted to make. Now moving on, where do these prime numbers come from? This 13, 17 that the cicadas exploit. Where do these prime numbers come from? They aren't made of atoms. They aren't driven by the laws of physics, because numbers are abstract, and they certainly don't evolve. So they are eternal, and most importantly, they are non-physical truths. You might have heard that mathematicians often say that they don't invent math. They don't invent mathematics, they discover it. And so these mathematical truths, which includes the geometric forms, the properties of prime numbers, the values of mathematical constants, this exists in the Platonic space. Okay, so how does Michael Levin explain this in terms of behaviors? So what Michael Levin proposes is that this Platonic space doesn't just hold static facts about numbers and geometry. It is a vast structured, invisible landscape that also holds kinds of minds. So let me write it down here. Kinds of minds. So what are these? These are pre-existing patterns of behavior or problem solving algorithms as well as anatomical shapes. By anatomical shapes, I think he most probably means the various shapes of organisms that you see around us. Anyways, in his framework, the physical bodies, any physical body that you see around us, whether they are human brains, frog embryos, computers, or even cyborgs, these things they function as interfaces, or in other words, as mediums. So the physical body does not invent intelligence from dead matter, as conventional science says. Rather, they provide the hardware or the medium that allows these pre-existing kinds of minds, that is, the non-physical patterns of behavior and algorithms, to ingress into the physical world. So let me try to maybe draw a diagram and try to visualize it. So let's assume that this is the physical world that we live in. This is the physical world. And this is the Platonic space. And this is non-physical in nature. In this physical world, there are different bodies, the bodies of a human, different kinds of animals, and according to Michael Levin, even cyborgs. So, okay, so this denotes different bodies within the physical world, and maybe there are different patterns and anatomical shapes. And since they are non-physical in nature, so I don't know how to even visualize them. So I'm just drawing them like this. So these patterns use the bodies as a medium, as a hardware, to manifest themselves in the physical world, which Michael Levin terms it as ingress. So this thing uses this body to manifest or to access the physical world. And to use Michael Levin's vocabulary, ingress. He uses the term ingress. So these non-physical patterns use the human body or any physical body to ingress into the physical world, to access the physical world. Okay, so that's his idea. So now to summarize, Platonic space is a space that is a different realm of reality, which is not part of the physical world that we live in. And the Platonic space broadly contains two kinds of patterns. The number one is the low agency patterns. So these are low agency patterns, or low agency forms are static mathematical truths such as a geometric pattern or the properties of prime numbers and so on. The second and the more interesting one are the high agency forms or high agency patterns. So these forms contains complex structural patterns and behavioral propensities, and they are not just static truths as we have seen in the first one. So this contains behavioral propensities. So high agency patterns possess the behavioral propensities that scientists would recognize as kinds of minds, as something that we call living. So when these high agency patterns ingress into the physical body, they act in a certain way which we look at it and identify as life. We see it and say, okay, this thing is alive. But when a low agency form accesses a physical form and we look at it, we don't say it is as alive because it's very static in nature. But as I've said, when a high agency form accesses the physical realm or ingresses into the physical realm, we identified it as something living. So now let's, since we have now discovered all the concepts, let's now tie it all back to the xenobot's behavior. Specifically, we are trying to answer, how does Platonic space explain xenobot's behavior. So this is how you can explain it. When Michael Levin's team freed those frog cells from their natural environment, that is from the embryo, the cells didn't magically invent a new way of life from scratch. Instead, what they did was that their cellular structure acted as a kind of antenna. So again, let me just draw the diagram again. This is the Platonic space. This is the physical. So suppose this is a frog embryo, and this is a frog pattern, and this is a frog embryo. So when Michael Levin's team freed those frog cells, let's say this is one cell that has been freed from the frog embryo. Again, before that, let me just make this connection. So this frog pattern uses this frog embryo as a body to ingress into the physical world. But now that a single skin cell has been freed from the frog's embryo, now this frog pattern, by frog pattern I mean the behavior and the form of a frog. This is what I mean by a frog pattern. Now this frog pattern does not access this thing. So now there exists some different kind of behavioral propensities or a different kind of pattern within the Platonic space. This is how a xenobot, let's say this is how a xenobot behaves. So this pattern defines the xenobot's behavior. So now this separated cell acts as an antenna, and it tunes into a different region of the Platonic space. So instead of now tuning into this region of the Platonic space, now this body tunes into a different region. This is the new region, and it accesses, and now this cell acts as a medium or a body or a hardware, whatever the word you might want to use, you prefer to use. So it accesses, it tunes into this pattern. So it now tunes into a different region of the Platonic space, and it pulls down a completely new behavioral pattern, that is the xenobot mind. So this defines the xenobot behavior pattern. So that is how, so the Platonic space framework explains that the behavior of xenobots without using any history, evolutionary history or gene editing. That's because now it is no longer tuned to the frog pattern, and that's why it doesn't behave as a frog, or nor does it die down. Instead, it tunes into a different kind of pattern, the xenobot behavior pattern, and it starts behaving like a xenobot. And that is how we can explain why this thing behaves in completely new ways, in a way that normal frogs or normal frog cells do not behave, because it is now tuned to a different kind of mind in the Platonic space. So this is how Michael Levin explains xenobot's behavior. And the big consequence of this explanation is that behavior is not determined by genes' evolutionary history. Okay, it is neither explained by evolutionary history nor it can be explained by genes or gene editing. So genes are not the blueprint of life. That's is the main consequence of this explanation. And it's a main consequence because that's the prevailing understanding of what genes does. But as per Michael Levin's theory or hypothesis, genes are not the reasons that gives any organism its behavior or its form. Those things exist in a non-physical realm called the Platonic space. So that's the main consequence of this. So that's all for this video.